Okay, good morning, everyone. Everyone ready to study biblical theology? Good. I'd like to read with you here as we start Genesis 12, 1 through 4. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, into a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. Let's pray together. Great and eternal God of heaven and of earth, teach us thy truth. Help us to walk in thy ways. Help us to love thee and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent. We bless thee for this day. Thank thee so much, Lord, for the sunshine, but also and especially for the light that Jesus Christ is in the midst of this dark world. And all this we ask is in Jesus' name alone. Amen. Well, in our survey of biblical theology, we are speeding up a bit. We need to, because we've just covered the first few chapters of Genesis, and we're a third of our way into our semester, so we have a lot to cover yet. But these were foundational sections, and just as we examine the foundation of a building for a lot of clues as to what is going to happen from here on out, so too with biblical theology. We have been dealing with foundational matters, and now I think we can take a quicker pace. Now, what I want to do in today's lecture is I want to show how the post-diluvian context, who knows what post-diluvian is? Yes, after the flood, post-deluge or post-flood period. How this sets the stage for Abraham and God's work in Abraham and through Abraham later on. So that first of all, and then see how covenant, faith, and promise are opened up for us in the epochal events that take place in and around Abraham. What is God, in other words, what is God doing in Abraham and through Abraham that will be indicative of his covenantal purposes and plan that he has already begun to reveal in the garden through Adam, through his seed, through Noah, and so on. In other words, what does the Abrahamic period mean for the further organic development of God's own self-revelation? Catolo.
Sorry for disturbing, but I don't see today's lecture notes.
Yeah, I'm also trying to find
under today's...
Maybe I... Is that true for everyone here? I'm sorry. You're right. Part of it is I'm teaching two sections here. Right here. Is it up now? Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Catolo. Do that again if that happens again. God's purposes continue after the flood, especially as the Lord himself highlights, man multiplies himself over the earth and distributes himself. Yet, man gives himself over to idolatry and pursues his own proud ambition that ends in a curse, the curse of Babel. When God disperses people who refuse to go over the earth as he has commanded. And against this backdrop, God condescends to call a man, and in the way of faith and obedience dispenses blessing to him and through him that will affect the whole earth and all nations. Really, in this paragraph, you have in summary format what the whole Abrahamic period has to offer us here in terms of the unfolding of God's self-revelation. I want you to see that there's a certain parallelism between the post-lapsarian, so post-fall, and post-diluvian, post-flood periods. In the, really, that's confusing. In the post-lapsarian period, or the pre-flood period, we move from the proto-evangelium, that original promise of Genesis 3:15, to the defection of Cain, the wickedness of Lamech, and violence in all the earth. And so in the post-diluvian period, we move from the height of the Noahic covenant, as it's revealed there in chapter 9, to the defection of Ham, and to the wickedness of Babel. Because God had promised no more to destroy the earth, he punished the world with the confusion of language and the dispersion of the nations. He continued his promise with one man, Abram, the father of all believers. This parallelism between the post-fall period and the post-flood period is very telling. Okay, so we have wickedness abounding in both cases. We have a punishment. In this case, it's the flood. In this case, it's dispersion and language change. And we have God's grace being shown here to Noah and his descendants, and here to Abraham and his descendants, right? So there's a parallelism there. Do you see it? Yeah? And in both of these cases, interestingly enough, we have a covenantal revelation here. My covenant was introduced there in chapter 9 especially. It's actually present in 6, 7, 8, and 9, but especially in 9 with Noah. And we'll see something similar as well with Abraham. God's purposes do not stop even when man's wickedness is great on the earth. He continues what he has purposed. Okay? Now, Acts 17 verse 26 really is Paul's rendition of the biblical theology of this whole time, when he says, he hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. So God made mankind united, all from one blood, but he made them in order to distribute them throughout the earth. And when man himself did not do that, then God enforced that. That was his purpose. One blood, and yet dispersed and distributed. Do you know what Paul goes on to say in that passage in Acts 17? That man might seek after God. Right? That's what he did. He distributed man, he dispersed man all over the world in order that he would seek after God. But what did man do? Man made all kinds of idols, right? All different kinds of idols. All over this world on which he's been forced to be dispersed.
Professor,
Yes?
why the dispersion was, why did God do the dispersion in order to lead to his glory? Why the dispersion would make men seek after him?
That's a good question. What do you all think? I have an answer, but I want to see what all of you are thinking. Why does he say first to Adam and then later to Noah, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And what is the religious function of that? Yes, Joseph.
I think the answer is not so easy because we know that God is so, self-sufficient. He can exist with anything outside himself.
Right.
So what pleasure does he take in having fellowship with man? I think it is not that we need God, don't go needing man. So sometimes it is difficult to really know why God even created the whole world because he didn't need it. And he didn't need man to have fellowship with him, but man needed him. So to me, I think it is out of his eternal pleasure.
Yes, to glorify himself. He made this earth that it might be inhabited, it says somewhere. Where does it say that? That's a verse in the Bible, isn't it? He made this earth that it might be inhabited. Yeah. Right, it fills the earth which he has made, if it's right, with and also, and we'll get to this with Babel, what's the danger of people all congregating in the same place and trying to amass through religious symbols, through idolatry, they want to amass to themselves a name and power, and that's not what God had intended, at least not here. So, hold your question. We're going to answer it when we come to Babel. Because there we see how the opposite takes place. Okay, so there's the parallelism. You see that in graph form here in our outline. Proto-evangelium, Noahic covenant, defection of Cain, defection of Ham, prowess of Lamech, prowess of Nimrod, we'll come to that in a minute, violence of the earth, pride of men, the flood, and Babel. Now, chapter 10, which is right there, before Abraham in chapter 11 and 12, we have the table of the nations. In this crucial chapter, we have a sweeping genealogical view of the whole period, including the effects of the next chapter, lands, tongue, families, and nations. Notice that some people have imagined that Genesis 10 takes place before chapter 12, but actually chapter 10 is setting the stage for all that happens. It's giving us all the genealogies, even of people who would follow much later after the Tower of Babel. And look especially with me at chapter 10, verse 8. And Cush begat Nimrod. And he began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was what? Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Okay? And out of that land went forth Ashur and builded Nineveh and the city Rehoboth and Calah and so on. So we're dealing here with ancient Mesopotamia as we know it. Now when we come to the Tower of Babel, notice how it says, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar. Exactly the same place as what was referred to there earlier in chapter 10. So this is what's happening in chapter 11 is happening under the auspices of and at the behest of Nimrod, most likely then, this mighty hunter before the Lord. Now this word hunter is not to be taken in the term in which we use it, especially in this fall season here in Michigan and states like Michigan where hunting is big. A lot of the ancient world would portray their king as a hunter, right? Babylonians and Mesopotamians, you can see them. If you look at their iconography, a lot of them are drawing an arrow. And what this connoted was, what this conveyed was that this leader was a man of violence, was a man of prowess, and you didn't dare come against him. In fact, he would have the trophies of other nations. Really, he would array them in such a way that you knew that he had been victorious over so many kings and all the rest of that. So that's what's being meant here. By the way, if you ever preach on Nimrod, read Calvin's commentary on Genesis on chapter 10 and 11, because he's very good on this, very insightful. He sees the Tower of Babel being orchestrated there at the behest of Nimrod, this mighty hunter. In fact, he takes it this far. In fact, I have a quote from Calvin here, right here. Let me just make sure that we're not missing anything here. Oh yeah, Japheth, Ham, Shem, those are the basic tribes as they set forth all over the world. But God is behind all of this. Okay, now drop now to 3 about Nimrod and Babel. Calvin says this about Nimrod. Nimrod was a furious man and approximated the beasts rather than to men. The expression before the Lord, a mighty hunter before the Lord, seems to me to declare that Nimrod attempted to raise himself above the order of men. Just as vain men become transposed with a vain self-confidence that they may look down from the clouds upon others. Moses says that Nimrod, as if forgetting that he was a man, took possession of a higher post of honor. Noah was at that time yet living and was certainly great and venerable in the eyes of all. There were also other excellent men, but such was their moderation that they cultivated equality with their inferiors, who yielded them a spontaneous rather than a forced reverence. The ambition of Nimrod disturbed and broke through the boundaries of this reverence. Moreover, since it sufficiently appears that in this sentence of Moses the tyrant is branded with an eternal mark of infamy, we may hence conclude how highly pleasing to God is a mild administration of affairs among men. And truly whosoever remembers that he is a man will gladly cultivate the society of others. Now, Calvin goes on in chapter 12 of his commentary to speak about how Nimrod is basically behind this endeavor there to build this Tower of Babel. And what we have there is really a religious program. A religious program that God will contrast himself with in the calling of Abraham. Because notice how in Genesis 11, 1 through 9, man moves together and stays together. Whereas in the case of Abram, God calls Abram away from his clan and from his country and from his kindred. And in Genesis 11, man makes his own plans. Whereas here, this should be God reveals his plans, because God's made these plans a long time ago. Okay? In Genesis 11, man builds a tower, whereas in Genesis 12, he tells Abram to go to a land that I will show you. By the way, Hebrews works with this. Does anyone know what I'm referring to here? When Hebrews 11 talks about the patriarchs, how they wandered, how they sojourned in a country that was not theirs, and they looked for a city which had foundations, whose builder and maker was God. So God had revealed to Abraham that he would provide for him a city, right? I remember the first time I realized this. Go to the land, go to the place that I will show you, right? Is that what it says? What does it say in Genesis 12? To the land that I will show you. I will show you. A lot of times, I used to think, well, that's, Abram was to set on this journey, and somehow he would know, God would show him this is the land. But God's basically saying, I will be your revealer. I will show you what you need to know about the destiny and the inheritance that is yours. I'm the builder of it. I'm the architect of it. And you're going to walk by faith. You're going to follow my direction. But you'll inherit all these things. They'll be yours. But they come from me. So here we see the great contrast between man building a city in Mesopotamia there and God showing Abraham a city which has found true foundations which he has built. Man seeks a connection with heaven. Let us build a tower whose top will reach into heaven. Shemayim is the Hebrew word there. Which will reach into heaven. And man seeks after a name, and let us make a name for ourselves. Right? Is there something funny?
I don't know, we know that.
No, when you say Sham,
I know that one.
Shemayim.
Yeah.
Good. Heavens. Good. Dr. Barrett told me to pepper my lectures with Hebrew to reinforce.
So,
Just kidding.
When they say let's make a name for ourselves, because at that time, I don't think it was only one nation, because it was only one language. So I think it's safe to assume it's only one nation. So when they say let us make a name for ourselves, I don't think they are saying we want to be a good nation among the other nations.
No.
Perhaps they're saying let us make a name for ourselves instead of a name for God.
Right. Man wants to promote his own name.
I wonder how this played out at that time. I mean, did they have a council that would say, gather and how does the whole nation decide let us make a name for ourselves?
Yeah. How does that happen today? How does that happen today where nations make a name for themselves? I mean, yes, usually it comes from, someone spearheads this, right? And America needs to be stronger in our world, and so you have people who really run and they nurture patriotic feelings and all the rest of this. And I'm not saying that some degree of that is but why is it, this is the more fundamental question, why isn't it that man is concerned to make a name for himself? It says something about how we've been created and something about how we've fallen. Catolo.
Yeah, I was wondering, does it have to do with wanting to be self-sufficient, wanting to be my own person? I don't need, in a sense, I don't need any other help. I can do this all by myself. I'm my own person. I can, what's it, self-made person kind of thing.
It is.
God's assistance.
Exactly. But why is it that we're driven to do that?
I think man was created for exaltation, to exalt God. So then once you fall into sin, that heart is still active, but it has to be bent towards yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Was Luther or Calvin, I forget which one, who said that man is curved in on himself, right? I've given you Hebrew, so here's Latin. Incurvatus ad se. We're curved in on ourselves.
I think what's Luther that I think sin is the man curving on himself.
Yeah. So you're exactly right. We've been created for the glory of God's name. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament declares his handiwork. All of creation glorifies God, yes, albeit under a curse now, except man's image bearer, who was created to glorify God. And we only learn to do this when we're renewed after the image of Christ, who said, I have glorified thy name in the earth. That's what he said to his Father, John 17, verse 3. I've glorified thy name in the earth. I've finished the work that thou hast given me to do. So man is wanting to make a name for himself, and God is wanting to make Abraham's name great. I will make of you a great nation. I will make your name great, he says. Man attempts to avoid dispersion, and God gives blessing to Abraham, and Abraham will be a blessing to all the families of the earth. This is man's platform. This is God's platform. This is man's ambition. This is God's ambition, right? This is humanism, right? And this is God's covenant of grace, essentially. This is working out of His plan in the world. Humanism is extremely potent. It's the religion of man, really, is essentially what it is. How can we serve man? How can we serve ourselves? How can we make our own name great? This operates, by the way, not just in the heart of the unconverted. This operates in the heart of even the regenerate. And they need to be exposed to it again and again, and they need to mortify it. People want to make a name for themselves. Many Christians out there are wanting to make a name for themselves, to push their name and to brand. Really, that's a powerful dynamic, isn't it? I mean, they talk about this. Those of you who have lived in the corporate world, you have the branding departments of whole corporations that are out for one thing, and that is to get your name out there and to get your name as untarnished as possible. And so 24 hours a day, you're focused on your name, right? The Apple brand, right? The Google brand, all these brands that have just overtaken our world, to get your name out there. But Christians can do this too, right? And we put our name on everything, and we want our name to be out there. And we need to make the name of Christ glorious. That's why we're called Christians, right? Because the name of Christ is right in our own name, right? Christians, right? Now, what does all of this mean for biblical theology in terms of Abram? If we had moved directly from Noah to Abraham, we would have missed the potency of God's plan as it lies completely antithetical to man's plan. There's something corrupt about this. It has a lot that seems similar, right? Name, heaven, plan, build, but it's twisted. And it's this whole curved in on ourselves things. Why is it that man builds a tower that wants to reach into heaven? I think it's because he feels that there's a gulf between himself and God, and he wants to bridge that from his side, right? It's interesting. The image of God is something that it even comes out in the worst of sins, but in such a corrupted way. Yeah, Felipe.
Why is it for more childish reasons that they built a tower? Perhaps too, they thought that God is in heaven, so let us go to God. Literally going to God, like physically walking. The reason I'm saying this is because it's not only among, I'm not just saying this out of my own head. The Muslims, they believe on this. They believe in man, angel, and also a third kind of being called a genie that is made of smoke and fire. And they believe that these genies, they pack on top of each other, one on the shoulder of another, to go up to heaven and see what Allah is speaking with the angels. So it's not only something that I'm just coming up with. So I thought perhaps they built this tower for more childish reasons. Let us go and see the glory of God but in a non-biblical manner. Could it be a wrong form of worship? Yeah. Or is just a self-worship?
Oh, it is. It is. It's childish, but we're all children. We're either children of the devil or we're children of God, right? Even believers. Oh, well, I mean, we're called to be grown men, right? Strong men, strong women, strong people of God, but we're still children because we depend on God to reveal Himself to us. But you're right. Here's the basic problem. Man knows he has to worship. And he wants to worship himself. And he wants to worship on his own terms. He wants to worship through material, right? And yet he knows that he can't. I mean, there's more, obviously, to this world than stuff. And so what he tries to do is he tries to animate material, which, by the way, is the great animism principle that underlies a lot of religion. That if I go to a certain image, or I go to a certain place, a contact point, a certain temple even, there's contact here between material and immaterial, right? And of course the devil uses this, right? The spirit world knows that man has this animistic principle in himself, and so he uses that to sway the minds and hearts and gets the allegiance and the bondage of people as it relates to things. You see this in you see this in Asia, you see this in Africa, you see this in North America. I was just listening to the radio the other day, and this fellow said he went to India and visited people, and what they do is they get a gold statue and they put it in their house, if they're wealthy enough to do this, in the middle of the room, and they put all the chairs around it, right? So that they can all sit around and look at this. This is their focal point in the idolatry, right? And so what do people in North America do? Well, they buy a big screen TV and they put it in the center of the room so that everyone can fixate on this external reality that's coming to them and telling them what they need to look like, what they need to be preoccupied with, how they need to dress. And it's just constantly feeding them with what they need to become. We become what we worship, right? We become what we worship. What's being broadcasted, I'm not saying that TV itself is the idol, but it becomes a locus through which a lot of idolatry is taking place. What you see being broadcasted on television is setting the agenda for the next year and 10 years and 20 years and all the rest of that. We become what we worship. And unless we see that, we're actually part of that system, right? So we have our idols. We're blind to our own idols. That's how it works. We see the man who's bowing down before gold, but we don't see that our malls are being constructed in such a way that we're entering into temples of materialism and consumerism. So, humanism and the divine plan. I just want to make sure I answer your question. So childishness, yes. Man thinks, imagines, and this is his corrupted mind. He wants to worship. He knows he needs to worship, but he wants to worship on his own terms. And so he worships through material, but he knows that doesn't quite cut it. So he brings together animistic impulses and materialistic impulses. And, the strange thing is, man has his own theology, which in a way is just a corruption of the ultimate theology. So we have the Son of God who is divine and human, right? He bridged the gap that no one else could ever bridge. Not just by coming to this earth as a spirit, not just coming to this earth by looking like a man, but by taking to himself a human nature without ceasing to be divine, right? So he came and he tabernacled among us. When you study ancient religions or even current religions, you see that a lot of these impulses are there, except they're corrupt. And ultimately the Bible itself gives us the truth. Well, I want to speak here a little bit more about the covenant and some other elements that come out in the Abrahamic period. If the pre- and post-Diluvian period erected the pillars on which redemptive history would rise, the Abrahamic period supplied the sure foundation on which the house of God would be built. It provides the language so important to the New Testament: call, faith, promise, blessing, seed, Israel, curse, bondage, justification, provision. Lamb is another one. These are all terms that Paul's theology and the Gospels are so full of, right? It delineates a land. It focuses us on a blessing. It gives us really another concept is seed. Seed. In thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, God tells Abraham. Those are all things that the New Testament does a lot with. Okay? In Abraham, it is given a meaningful context, a rich language, and a sublime focus. If we skipped from the post-Diluvian straight to the Mosaic period, the strictures and structures might have well seemed to have derailed the mother promise. They wouldn't, but it might seem that way. However, the Abrahamic period is absolutely fundamental. In the words of Owen, as God now intended to set up a new phase of the church through the visible separation from the world and its involvement in false religion and corruption, so he laid the foundation and the demonstration of faith, obedience, and holiness of those called into it, and through it into the promises of the coming Messiah himself. It's a remarkable thing that when we see this wandering man living in tents in a land that's not his own, with, for a long time, not even his own descendant, but all he has is a promise that God will give him a seed, and through his seed would all the nations of the earth be blessed. I mean, who would have ever thought that that is what we'd be talking about here? 4,000 years later, here on the other side of the world, is a man who wandered about and sojourned, didn't have a place to call his own here in the world. He lived, he sojourned, he was a nomad. What made that happen? It was God. It was the promise that took hold of him. It was God who was, by promise, giving him faith, strengthening his faith, encouraging his faith. It's astounding. It's astounding that we're in this room not here worshiping Nimrod, but we're speaking about Abraham, and we're worshiping the God of Abraham. How can you explain that except that God has revealed that himself? I think that itself is one great argument for the truthfulness of Christianity. Is man would never have come up with that story. I mean, would you come up with that story? No. We would have some great... I mean, when you even think about how history gets written, the history of our nations, teaching my kids American history, and we love to highlight the man's prowess, man's ability, right? The self-made man, as you talked about. Abraham, and the record of Scripture is very honest about Abraham. He was full of faults and failings. Yes, there are times in which faith shines brilliantly, but often, the whole incident with Hagar, right? For a long time, he's on the wrong track in terms of how he's living and how, right? And is that the father of the faithful? Well, clearly God is behind all of that, and God is bringing a name for himself. Well, we have to focus here on the Abrahamic Covenant, because covenant is very significant in the Abrahamic material. It's revealed for us on four occasions. First of all, initially, in chapter 12, 1 through 3, as we read it. Then it's revealed soteriologically, focused on salvation, if you will. It's revealed sacramentally, focused on the sign and seal. And it's revealed conclusively there in 22, verse 15 through 19, after the near sacrifice of Isaac. And the four elements that recur in each, I have three here: land, seed, and blessing. The four